The high desert wind carries secrets. But on this day, it howled a story of brutal justice. What crime could a woman commit to warrant being dragged by a horse through the choked dust of a town square? Her life measured in the agonizing scrape of dirt and stone. It wasn't theft. It wasn't murder. Her crime was a single spoken word: no. This is the story of that refusal of the rancher who witnessed the torment, and of the single world-changing gunshot that was not an end, but a terrifying beginning. This is the story of Miranda Lowell and the rancher's bullet. The town of Redemption Gulch was named with a hope that had long since withered and died on the vine. It sat nestled in a sun-scorched valley in the Arizona Territory, a collection of clapboard buildings bleached to the color of bone by a relentless sun. Hope was a currency scarcer than water, and what little of it existed was minted and controlled by one man, Silas Cain. Silas wasn't a rancher or a miner in the traditional sense. He was a harvester of men. He owned the saloon, the general store, the livery, and most importantly, the only reliable well for 50 miles. To live in Redemption Gulch was to live under the shadow of Silas Cain, a shadow that stretched long and cold even at high noon. He was a man of contrasts, impeccably dressed in tailored Eastern suits that defied the dust, yet possessing eyes as cold and primitive as a coiled rattlesnake. His obsession for the better part of a year had been Miranda Lowell. Miranda was an anomaly in Redemption Gulch. She had arrived 2 years prior, not as a mail-order bride or a saloon girl, but as the inheritor of her late father's blacksmith forge. Thaddeus Lowell had been a quiet, stubborn man, and his daughter was forged from the same steel. Where other women were wilting flowers, Miranda was a sturdy yucca resilient and armed with her own quiet defense. Her hands, though often smudged with soot, could calm a spooked horse or hammer a glowing piece of iron into a perfect horseshoe. Her beauty wasn't delicate. It was fierce, carried in the straight line of her back, the intelligence in her clear grey eyes, and a cascade of dark auburn hair she kept ruthlessly tied back. Silas Cain, who believed he owned everything worth having, saw Miranda as the final, most exquisite piece for his collection. He didn't court her with flowers or poetry. He courted her with power. He'd offer her discounts at his store, ensure the rowdiest drunks gave her forge a wide berth, and speak to her in a low, proprietary tone that made her skin crawl. "A woman like you shouldn't be sweating over an anvil, Miranda," he'd say, leaning against the doorframe of her smithy, his expensive cologne a foul intruder amidst the honest scents of coal and iron. "Your hands were made for silk, not hammers." "My hands were made to work, Mr. Cain," she would reply without looking up from her task. "Just like my father's before me." His patience, a notoriously thin commodity, finally snapped on a sweltering Tuesday in August. He didn't come to the forge. He sent 2 of his hired guns, hulking brutes named Pike and Cletus, to escort her to the center of town. The entire population of Redemption Gulch, the tired miners, the wary shopkeepers, the hollow-eyed women, all trickled out of their establishments, drawn by a sense of impending theater. They knew Silas's moods, and the air was thick with the promise of either a celebration or a crucifixion. Silas stood on the porch of his saloon, the Golden Rattler. He'd had a small platform erected. He waited until Miranda was standing before him, her face a mask of controlled fury, her eyes scanning the crowd for a friendly face and finding only averted gazes. "People of Redemption, Gulch." Silas's voice boomed rich and practiced. "You have seen me build this town from dust and despair. You have seen me bring order where there was chaos. And now you will see me bring beauty and grace to its heart." He descended the steps and walked towards Miranda, his movements smooth and predatory. He stopped a foot from her, his gaze sweeping over her as if she were a prized mare at auction. "Miranda Lowell," he said, his voice dropping to a more intimate yet still public volume. "I have offered you my protection. I have offered you my wealth. Today, I offer you my name. Be my wife. You will be the queen of this valley and want for nothing for the rest of your days." It wasn't a proposal. It was a coronation of his own ego. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the buzzing of flies and the nervous cough of an old prospector. Miranda's chin was high. She met his gaze, and for the first time, the town saw a flicker of something other than fear directed at Silas Cain. They saw defiance. "Mr. Cain," she said, her voice steady and clear, ringing out across the square. "I thank you for the grandeur of your offer. But I must decline. I am not for sale, and I am not in need of a king." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. It was a sound Silas had never heard in his town. It was the sound of his authority being publicly questioned. His handsome face tightened, the pleasant mask falling away to reveal the raw, ugly ambition beneath. A vein throbbed in his temple. "You would refuse me." He whispered the words, a venomous hiss. "In front of them. I would refuse you in a cathedral filled with angels or a tavern filled with thieves, Mr. Cain. The setting doesn't change the answer. The answer is no." The snap was audible. Silas's face contorted into a mask of pure rage. He turned to the crowd, his arm outstretched, pointing a trembling finger at Miranda. You see the arrogance. This is what happens when order is met with insolence. She needs to be taught a lesson in humility, a lesson this entire town will remember." He spun back to his men, pike, the bay, and a rope. Fear stark and cold now washed over the crowd. This was moving beyond public humiliation. Men started to shuffle backward. Women pulled their children close. They knew Silas's cruelty, but it was usually a cold, calculated thing, a foreclosure, a quiet threat. This was different. This was fire. Pike led a powerful bay horse forward, its eyes red and rolling. Cletus followed with a thick length of hemp rope. Miranda's composure finally broke a flash of pure terror in her eyes. She took a step back, but the two thugs grabbed her arms, their grips like iron vices. "No," she breathed, struggling against them. "Silas, you can't." "I can do anything I want." He snarled, his face inches from hers. "You will learn respect. You will learn that my will is the only law here." They tied one end of the rope around the saddle horn. Then, ignoring her desperate pleas, they brutally tied the other end around her wrists, binding them together. The townspeople watched in horrified silence, their collective shame a palpable force. They were trapped cowards in their own lives, watching a brave woman pay the price for a courage they didn't possess. "Drag her." Silas commanded, his voice flat and devoid of any human warmth. "Let her feel the dirt of the town she claims to be too good for." Pike swung into the saddle, kicked the bay's flanks, and the horse bolted. Miranda's scream was ripped from her lungs as she was yanked off her feet. The ground came up with a brutal, stunning impact. Dust and gravel filled her mouth, her nose, her eyes. The world became a blur of brown earth, splintered wood, and agonizing pain. The skin on her back and legs was scraped raw in the first 10 feet. Her simple dress was shredded, her boots torn away. The rough hemp bit deep into her wrists. But that pain was a distant star compared to the searing, grinding agony of being dragged over the hard-packed earth. She tumbled and twisted her head, slamming against the ground. The faces of the townspeople were a sickening, silent frieze of horror. Silas Cain stood on the saloon porch, a grim smile of satisfaction on his face, watching his lesson unfold. The bay, spooked and powerful, galloped in a wide, cruel circle around the square. Each foot was a new torment, a fresh wave of fire licking across Miranda's body. Her screams had subsided into choked, desperate sobs. Her strength was failing. Blackness crept at the edges of her vision. This was it. This was how her story would end, a broken thing in the dirt, a warning to anyone else who dared to have a will of their own. Then came the shot. It wasn't the loud, booming clap of a Colt or a Remington that the townsfolk were used to. It was a sharp, flat crack, a sound with lethal authority. It echoed off the false fronts of the buildings and seemed to hang in the air for a heartbeat. For a split second, nothing changed. Then, with impossible precision, the taut rope leading from the saddle horn went slack. Severed. The bay, freed of its terrible burden, continued its panicked run. But Miranda Lowell lay still in the center of the square, a crumpled, bleeding heap. The rope, sliced clean through a foot from her wrists, lay beside her. Every eye in Redemption Gulch turned towards the source of the shot. Standing at the edge of town, where the main street bled into the open desert, was a man. He was tall and lean, framed by the unforgiving sun. He held a Sharps rifle, a long, heavy weapon known for its range and accuracy, resting lightly in his hands. He wasn't a townsman. He was a rancher, judging by his worn leather chaps and the dust that seemed a permanent part of his clothing. He had a low-crowned hat, pulled down, shadowing a face that was all sharp angles and sun-cured leather. A thick, dark beard and mustache covered his lower face, but his eyes, even from a distance, were like chips of flint. This was Zachariah "Zach" Whitman. His small, isolated ranch was a dozen miles south, and he came to town only when necessity demanded it, his silence as much a part of him as his shadow. He had been leading his pack mule towards the general store when he'd crested the slight rise overlooking the town and seen the horror unfold. He hadn't hesitated. Raising the Sharps, he'd taken a breath, accounted for the horse's movement, the rope's tension, the distance, and squeezed the trigger. It was a shot most men wouldn't even attempt, let alone make. Hitting a man on a moving horse was hard enough. Hitting the rope dragging him was the stuff of legend. Zachariah Whitman lowered the rifle, his gaze locking with Silas Cain's across the 100 yards of dusty ground. The silence was now of a different kind. It was no longer the silence of fear, but of shock and a dawning, terrifying anticipation. A new player had just entered the game, not with a whisper, but with the roar of a .50 caliber bullet. Silas Cain's face was a thundercloud of disbelief and fury. Someone had dared to interfere. He pointed a shaking finger at the newcomer. "Who the hell are you?" he roared. Zachariah didn't answer. He began to walk forward, his stride unhurried, his boots crunching softly in the dirt. The Sharps rifle was now held loosely in one hand, but it might as well have been an extension of his arm. He walked past the silent, staring townspeople, his focus entirely on the two men, Pike and Cletus, who were now dismounting and drawing their own pistols, and on Silas Cain, whose hand was hovering over the pearl-handled revolver on his hip. He stopped 10 feet from where Miranda lay, a protective position between her and Silas's men. He finally spoke, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to come from deep in his chest. "That's far enough for that animal." He nodded towards Pike. "And for you." His flinty eyes settled on Silas. "You just signed your own death warrant." "Stranger," Pike growled, raising his pistol. Zachariah's movement was a blur. He didn't raise the heavy rifle. He dropped it, and in the same fluid motion, his right hand swept back his duster, and a Colt peacemaker appeared in his hand, as if by magic. He didn't fire. He simply cocked it. The click-clack of the hammer being drawn back was unnaturally loud, in the silence a sound more final than any gunshot. It was a sound that said a decision had already been made. Pike froze. Cletus, who had been a half-second behind, froze as well. They were hired guns, not suicidal fools. They saw the look in Zachariah's eyes, a complete and utter lack of fear, replaced by a cold, settled calm that was far more dangerous. Zachariah's gaze shifted to Miranda's still form. "She needs a doctor, not your boot heels." Silas Cain, recovering his composure, took a step forward. "This is my town. That is my business. You have no say here, rancher. Your business is torturing women for public sport." Zachariah's voice was laced with a contempt that was like a physical slap. "Out here, we call that something else." He spared a glance at the townspeople, his eyes sweeping over them with disdain. "And you people, you just watched." Shame, hot and bitter, caused dozens of men to look at the ground. Without taking his eyes off Silas, Zachariah knelt beside Miranda. He gently, expertly began to work at the knots on her wrists, his large, calloused hands surprisingly nimble. Her breathing was shallow, a pained whimper escaping her lips. "Get away from her," Silas commanded. Zachariah ignored him. He freed her wrists, revealing the raw, bleeding flesh beneath the rope burns. With an almost tender motion, he gathered her limp form into his arms. She was lighter than he expected. He stood up, holding her against his chest, her blood soaking into his shirt. He turned to leave the way he came. "I didn't say you could go." Silas's voice was deadly. "No one turns their back on me." Zachariah stopped. He didn't turn around. A man who has to say that he said, his voice carrying clearly back to Silas, has nothing behind him worth looking at. He took another step. "Kill him!" Silas shrieked, his control finally shattering completely. Pike and Cletus, spurred by the direct command from the man who paid them, raised their pistols. They never got the chance to fire. From the rooftop of the blacksmith's forge. Her forge came the sharp crack of a Winchester. A chunk of wood splintered from the saloon porch post, a foot from Silas's head. He screamed and threw himself to the floor. Pike and Cletus spun around, looking for the source of the shot. On the roof, a grizzled old man with a flowing white beard stood up, levering another round into the chamber of his rifle. It was Alistair Finch, the town's drunk, and a veteran of the Mexican-American War, whom Miranda often gave a hot meal in exchange for sweeping the smithy. He was sober today, and his aim was still true. "Next one's for meat." Alistair yelled, his voice cracking with age and whiskey, but his intent clear. That was the crack in the dam. The town's fear of Silas was still great, but the spectacle of his humiliation, combined with the sudden, unexpected appearance of two armed men standing up to him, created a new volatile chemistry. An old miner, emboldened, hefted his pickaxe. The livery owner quietly barred the door to his stables. Zachariah used the moment of chaos. He didn't run. He continued his steady, deliberate walk out of town, carrying Miranda as if she weighed nothing. He reached his pack mule gently, laid her across its back, and with one last, cold look at the disorder he had created, he grabbed the reins of his own horse and walked out into the vast, indifferent desert, leaving the smouldering ruins of Silas Cain's authority behind him. But he knew with a certainty that settled deep in his gut this was far from over. He hadn't just saved a woman. He had declared war. And in Silas Cain's kingdom, war was a fight to the death. The journey to Zachariah Whitman's ranch was a blur of rhythmic agony for Miranda. Each step of the mule sent a fresh wave of fire through her ravaged body. The sun beat down, and the world was a hazy mix of the scent of Zachariah's leather vest, the dust from the trail, and the coppery taste of her own blood. She drifted in and out of consciousness, each waking moment a sharp reminder of the grinding dirt, the jeering silence of her neighbors, and the terrifying, smiling face of Silas Cain. Her last coherent thought before darkness took her completely was the image of a rifle barrel, a steady hand, and the impossible severing of a rope. A savior. Or her fevered mind whispered just a different kind of danger. Zachariah's ranch wasn't a sprawling empire like the ones found in lusher territories. It was a testament to one man's sheer force of will against an unforgiving landscape. Tucked into a narrow canyon carved by a seasonal creek, the small, sturdy cabin was built of thick, dark timber and local stone, looking less like it was built on the land and more like it had grown out of it. It was defensible with a clear line of sight down the canyon approach and solid rock at its back. A small, well-tended corral held 2 horses, and a patch of irrigated garden showed a stubborn splash of green against the ochre rock. This was a place built for solitude, for survival, a fortress of memory. He carried her inside, laying her gently on the only bed, a simple frame with a horsehair mattress. The cabin was sparse, meticulously clean. A stone fireplace, a table with 2 chairs, shelves, holding a few books and pegs on the wall for his hat and rifle. It was the home of a man who owned little and needed less. For the next 2 days, Zachariah was no longer a gunman, but a nurse. He cleaned her wounds with whiskey and hot water, his touch surprisingly gentle. The abrasions on her back and legs were severe, a brutal patchwork of raw skin and deep bruises. He found an old, clean linen shirt of his own and carefully dressed her in it after applying a salve of comfrey and yarrow he'd made himself. He brewed a bitter tea from willow bark for the pain and fever, patiently lifting her head and helping her sip it. During this time, Miranda floated in a twilight of pain and fever dreams. She saw Silas's face twisted in rage. She felt the rope burn her wrists. But through the haze, another image began to form, a quiet, bearded man. His flinty eyes softened with a concern she couldn't quite believe. She'd wake for moments feeling a cool cloth on her forehead, or the steady pressure of his hand helping her drink before succumbing to the darkness again. On the 3rd morning, the fever broke. She woke to the smell of coffee and frying bacon. The pain was no longer a raging fire, but a deep, throbbing ache. She slowly pushed herself up her muscles, screaming in protest. She was wearing a man's large shirt, and her wounds had been cleaned and dressed. She looked around the small, quiet cabin. Zachariah was at the fireplace, his back to her. He seemed to sense her movement, turning with a plate in his hand. "You're awake," he said. It was a statement, not a question. Where am I?" she asked, her voice a hoarse whisper. My place. You're safe here. For now. He placed the plate on the small table. You need to eat. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, a wave of dizziness washing over her. The pain was sharp but manageable. He didn't rush to help her, just stood and watched, letting her find her own strength. She slowly, painfully made her way to the table and sat down. The food, bacon, beans, and a hard biscuit seemed like the most wonderful meal she had ever seen. She ate in silence for a few minutes, ravenously. He poured her a cup of coffee and sat opposite her, nursing his own. The silence wasn't awkward. It was heavy, filled with unspoken questions. Why, she finally asked, looking up at him. Her grey eyes, though shadowed with exhaustion, were clear and direct. You could have been killed. You challenged Silas Cain for a stranger. Zachariah looked down at his coffee cup, swirling the dark liquid. His face was a landscape of its own, carved with lines that spoke of sun, wind, and something deeper, something sorrowful. I've seen men like Cain before. He said, his voice a low rumble. Men who think the world is a thing to be broken to their will, who think people are just tools or ornaments. He paused, and a darkness flickered in his eyes, a shadow from a distant storm. I saw a woman being tortured. The why of it didn't matter as much as the fact of it. His gaze drifted to a small, faded photograph on the mantelpiece. It was a sepia-toned image of a smiling young woman with bright eyes and a cascade of blonde hair standing beside a much younger, clean-shaven Zachariah. He looked happy, open, a different man entirely. My wife, Sarah, he said, his voice softening with a raw, ancient grief. We had a small farm back in Missouri. We didn't have much, but we had the land, and we had each other. He fell silent, lost in the memory. Miranda waited, sensing this was a story he rarely, if ever, told. There was a man there, a landowner, Mr. Abernathy. He wanted our land. It had a creek that ran year-round. He tried to buy it. I said no. He tried to intimidate me. I stood my ground. I thought that was enough. I thought being right was a shield. He took a long, slow breath. One day I came back from town. Abernathy and his men were there. They weren't trying to intimidate me anymore. They'd decided to burn us out, to make an example. Sarah. She tried to stop them. He closed his eyes, the pain of the memory as fresh as if it were yesterday. They weren't content just to take the land. They wanted to break our spirit first. When I rode in, the barn was on fire, and they had her. The silence in the cabin was absolute. Miranda could barely breathe. I was too late. Zachariah said, his voice thick with self-recrimination. I was reckless. I charged in, full of rage. I killed 2 of them, but they killed her. She died in my arms. I lost everything that day because a man like Silas Cain decided what he wanted was more important than her life, than our life. He finally looked at Miranda, and she understood. The coldness in his eyes wasn't a lack of feeling. It was a wall built around a core of unimaginable pain. When I saw what Cain was doing to you, he said, his voice regaining its hard edge, I saw Abernathy. And I saw Sarah. I wasn't going to be too late again. The revelation hung between them, raw and profound. Miranda's own suffering felt suddenly intertwined with his. He hadn't just saved a stranger. He had tried to rewrite the most painful chapter of his own life. I'm sorry, Zachariah, she said softly, for your loss. He just nodded, the moment of vulnerability passing the mask of the stoic rancher, settling back into place. Eat. You need your strength. Cain won't let this go. He's been humiliated. A man like that can't abide being made to look weak. He'll see it as a debt, and he'll come to collect. He'll send his men, she stated, her own resolve hardening. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now overlaid with anger. Pike and Cletus, and more, Zachariah corrected. He'll deputize half the thugs and desperate men in the valley. He'll call it a posse. He'll tell them I'm a murderer, and you're a thief he was punishing. He'll twist the story until he's the hero. Then we can't stay here, she said, her mind racing. We need to run. Mexico. This cabin is a fortress compared to the open desert. He counted his gaze, sweeping the room. He'll expect us to run. He'll have riders watching the passes. No. We make our stand here, on our terms. He stood up and walked to the wall, taking down the Sharps rifle and a greener shotgun. He checked their actions with an expert's efficiency. This canyon has one way in. He'll have to come straight at us. I have food for a month, water in the well. We have rifles, and we have stone walls. A new dynamic settled between them. They were no longer rescuer and victim. They were partners in a war they hadn't chosen, but had to fight. Miranda, despite her aches, felt a surge of something she hadn't felt in days. Purpose. My father taught me to shoot, she said, her voice stronger now. A Winchester. I can handle a rifle. A flicker of respect showed in his eyes. Good. We'll need it. The next few days were a blur of preparation. As her body healed, Zachariah taught her the layout of the land, the blind spots, the best firing positions from the cabin's 2 small windows, and a loophole he'd built into the stone chimney. He had a small stash of dynamite for blasting rock, which he placed carefully near a narrow point in the canyon approach. They fell into a rhythm. He would watch the canyon entrance from a high ledge, while she would cook clean the rifles and manage their dwindling medical supplies. They spoke little, but a bond of shared circumstance, and mutual respect was being forged in the heat of their predicament. She saw the deep intelligence behind his silence, and he saw the unyielding steel beneath her pain. One evening, as the sun bled across the western sky, painting the canyon walls in hues of orange and purple, they saw a lone rider approaching, not with the aggression of a posse, but slowly, openly. Zachariah raised his field glasses. It's Doc Miller, he said, a note of suspicion in his voice. Doc Miller was a fixture in Redemption Gulch, a man who seemed to survive by remaining neutral. He was also one of the few people who knew the general location of Zachariah's isolated ranch. He might be coming to help, Miranda offered a sliver of hope in her voice. Or he might be a scout, Zachariah countered grimly. He raised his rifle. Let him get closer. Doc Miller rode to the base of the canyon and stopped, holding his hands up in the universal sign of peace. Zachariah Whitman. I've come to treat the girl Silas doesn't know I'm here. I came on my own. Zachariah watched him for a long, tense minute. Just you, Doc. Just me. On my oath. Zachariah lowered his rifle. All right, Doc. Come on up. But slow and easy. The portly doctor, sweating profusely, urged his horse up the narrow track. When he arrived, he dismounted, looking with professional concern at Miranda. Good Lord, child, I heard what he did, the doctor said, opening his medical bag. Let me see those wounds. I have proper bandages and carbolic acid. For the next hour, Doc Miller tended to Miranda's injuries, clucking his tongue at the brutality of the wounds and complimenting Zachariah's rough but effective field medicine. He was kind, gentle, and full of dire warnings about Silas Cain. "He's lost his mind," Zach Miller said, packing up his bag. "He's put a bounty on your head. $500. He's telling everyone you're a wanted man. From Kansas, and that you kidnapped Miss Lowell. The sheriff, being on Cain's payroll, signed the warrant himself. We expected as much." Zachariah said, his face unreadable. "You can't stay here," the doctor urged. "He's gathering a posse of at least 20 men. They'll ride out in a day or two. You need to get clear head for the border." "We appreciate the warning," Doc Zachariah said, his hand resting on the stock of his shotgun. Of course," Miller said, mounting his horse. "Just be careful. I'll do what I can to slow them down, buy you some time." He gave Miranda a final concerned look and rode away, disappearing down the canyon as dusk settled. Miranda felt a wave of gratitude. He's a good man. To risk coming here. Zachariah didn't answer. He was staring down the canyon where the doctor had vanished. The sun had set, and the first stars were appearing in the indigo sky. "What is it?" she asked. His horse, Zachariah said, his voice quiet and deadly. "It's a fine animal. Too fine for a small-town doctor. And it's shod with Cain's brand on the shoes. I saw it when he mounted." Miranda's heart went cold. "And there's more," Zachariah continued, his eyes scanning the darkening ridges above them. "When he was leaning over you, his saddlebag shifted. I saw the glint of a spyglass. He wasn't here to treat you, Miranda. He was here to confirm we were here. To scout our position. To see how many guns we had." The hope that had flickered within her was extinguished, replaced by the cold, hard reality of their situation. They were not just isolated. They were betrayed. The good doctor had been the Judas goat leading the wolves to their door. "He's bought you some time." Zachariah scoffed, a bitter, mirthless sound. "No. He just gave Silas our exact location and confirmed we're alone. The posse isn't coming in a day or two." He looked at her, his flinty eyes holding a grim certainty. "They're coming tonight." The moon, a sliver of bone-white crescent, offered little light as it climbed a sky of bruised purple. The canyon below was a river of shadows, and every gust of wind sounded like the footfalls of doom. Inside the cabin, Zachariah and Miranda worked in near darkness, a single lantern turned down to a mere glow. Doc Miller's betrayal had stripped away any illusion of safety, sharpening their world to a razor's point. He'll have told them about the windows and the chimney loophole. Zachariah murmured, his voice a low rumble, as he stacked their ammunition on the table. "They'll try to get men up on the ridges. It's a hard climb in the dark." Miranda countered, her voice tight but steady. She was loading her Winchester, the familiar metallic clicks, a small, defiant comfort in the oppressive silence. Her wounds throbbed an echo of the terror from the town square. But this was different. Now she was not helpless. She had a rifle in her hands and a wall at her back. They didn't have to wait long. A faint, unmistakable jingle of a harness drifted up the canyon. Zachariah, peering through a narrow slit he'd chipped beside the window frame, held up a hand. "They're here," he whispered, dismounting at the canyon mouth. At least a dozen. Miranda's heart hammered against her ribs. The abstract threat had finally taken shape, a collection of armed men, hidden by the night, coming to kill them. She moved to the second window, her knuckles white around the rifle's stock. The first probe came cautiously. 3 indistinct shapes moving from boulder to boulder, up the canyon floor, pistols drawn. "Let them get," to the narrow pass. Zachariah breathed his Sharps rifle, resting on the windowsill. His unnerving calm was that of a man who had made his peace with violence long ago. The figures crept forward until they reached the point where the canyon walls squeezed together, the very spot Zachariah had identified as the kill zone. Now, he said. He didn't fire his rifle. He touched a lit match to a long fuse that snaked out through a small hole in the cabin wall. The fuse sputtered a tiny, fast-moving spark in the darkness facing towards the dynamite he had planted earlier. The explosion was deafening. A brilliant flash of orange light momentarily lit the canyon like a scene from hell, followed by a gut-punching boom that echoed like the wrath of God. Rock and earth erupted upwards. The three men were thrown like dolls, their screams swallowed by the roar. When the dust settled, the narrow pass was choked with a massive, impassable rock slide. A volley of panicked, unaimed shots peppered the front of the cabin in response. "That'll keep the front door quiet," Zachariah said flatly. "Now they'll try the ridges." He was right. For the next hour, the battle became a deadly game of cat and mouse. Muzzle flashes erupted from the darkness above, and Zachariah would answer with a single, carefully aimed shot from the Sharps. He was conserving ammunition, making every bullet a statement. Miranda, watching the opposite ridge, found her own rhythm. Her fear sharpened into hyper-focused awareness, a shadow moving where it shouldn't. A glint of moonlight on a rifle barrel she fired, levered a new round and fired again. A bullet punched through the wall just above her head, showering her with splinters. She ducked her heart, seizing, then forced herself back to the window. In the crucible of the firefight, a strange thought surfaced. Silas Cain had wanted to break her to see her humbled, but this siege, this desperate struggle, was doing the opposite. It was forging her. The heat of battle was burning away the last of her fear, leaving behind something hard and pure, the will to live. During a lull, as Cain's men regrouped, Zachariah's voice cut through the tense quiet. "This is a lot of effort for a grudge," he said, his mind clearly working, beyond the immediate fight. $500 is a fortune to put on a man he thinks is just a drifter. There's a desperation here that goes beyond ego. He turned to her. "He didn't just want to marry you, Miranda. He wanted your land." "My land," she said with a dry, almost bitter laugh. "It's a dusty lot with a forge. It's barely worth the taxes." Your father, Thaddeus Zachariah, pressed his gaze intense in the dim light. He was a prospector before he was a blacksmith, wasn't he? "Yes," she confirmed. "He never found anything. Said the real gold was in shoeing horses." "Did he ever tell you not to sell the land? Insist on it?" Miranda's mind flashed back to one of her father's last fevered conversations. "Don't you ever sell the forge, Miranda. Not for any price. This is Lowell land. And don't go digging deep by the old well. The ground there is unstable." She had dismissed it as the sentimental rambling of a dying man. He did, she whispered the memory, suddenly taking on a chilling new weight. "He told me never to sell, and he warned me off the old well behind the forge." Zachariah was silent for a moment, the pieces of a puzzle clicking into place in his mind. He'd heard the old drunken rumors for years, whispers of a lost Spanish silver vein, the Veta de Sombra running through the valley. Most dismissed it as a myth. "Your forge isn't on some random plot of dust, Miranda," he said, his voice filled with a sudden startling certainty. "It sits directly over the old dried-up bed of Redemption Creek. the same creek that carved this very canyon. He looked at her, and the horrifying truth began to dawn. Cain doesn't have the only well for 50 miles because he was lucky. He has it because he dug deep enough in the right place. But it's not enough to support the kind of mining town he wants to build. For that he needs more water. A lot more. "My father," Miranda breathed. He didn't mean the ground was unstable. He found it. Zachariah stated the revelation hanging between them like smoke. Not silver. The source, the main aquifer for this entire region. It's under your land, Miranda. That's the secret. That's the treasure. Cain must have found an old survey or your father's prospecting journal. It all made a terrible, perfect sense. Cain's obsession was never about love. It was the cleanest way to get the land and its water rights. Her public refusal hadn't just wounded his pride. It had threatened to ruin a plan decades in the making. The torture wasn't just cruelty. It was a desperate attempt to break her and force her to sign the deed. Her rescue was a catastrophe for him. "He's not just trying to kill us," Miranda said the words tasting like ash. "He's trying to bury a secret." The nature of the fight had changed. It was no longer just about their survival. It was about justice. "Zachariah, if we get out of this, I'm not running. We're going to expose him." Before he could answer, a new sound joined the cacophony, the sharp crack and splintering of the heavy wooden bar on the door. One of Cain's men had slipped past the rock slide under the cover of the main assault. The door burst inward. A large, bearded man, a stranger with murder in his eyes, stood silhouetted against the night, a smoking pistol in his hand. He had a clear shot at Zachariah, whose back was to the door as he returned fire towards the ridge. Miranda didn't have time to think or shout. She acted. She swung the heavy Winchester rifle like a club, putting all her blacksmith-honed strength into the blow. The solid wood stock connected with the side of the man's head with a sickening thud. He crumpled to the floor unconscious. Zachariah spun around his sharps, coming to bear, only to see the threat neutralized. Miranda stood over the fallen gunman, breathing heavily, the rifle clutched in her hands. A look of profound, undisguised respect passed over his face. He had saved her from the horse, but she had just saved him from a bullet in the back. In that moment, they were truly equals in this war. He slammed the broken door shut, wedging the unconscious man's body against it as a temporary barricade. The situation had become untenable. "They know they can't wait us out until morning," Zachariah said, his mind racing. "When the sun comes up, their advantage of numbers is gone. They'll be easy targets. They're going to make one final all-out push." He looked from the barricaded door to the windows where gunfire was still erupting. They were pinned down, their ammunition, dwindling, their cabin breached. The end was closing in. "There's only one way out of this," he said, a desperate, dangerous idea forming in his eyes. "We can't win a defensive fight anymore. We have to take the fight to them." He looked at Miranda, his gaze intense. "I need a distraction. A big one. Can you give me 5 minutes?" "What are you going to do?" she asked, her heart pounding. "Cain will be at the back directing things," Zachariah said. "He's a coward. He won't be on the front lines. I'm going to do what he's been expecting us to do all along." "What's that run?" he said, a grim smile touching his lips for the first time. "But not away from him. I'm going to run straight at him." The plan was a flash of desperate genius, a final wild gamble. While Miranda unleashed a furious volley from the front windows, her rapid firing creating the illusion of a larger force Zachariah worked at the back of the cabin. The heavy wooden bar on the door was already splintering. Time was measured in heartbeats. "He thinks we're trapped," Zachariah grunted, forcing a crowbar into the mortar of the massive stone fireplace. "He's forgotten this cabin is built into the rock, not just on it." Behind the fire grate lay a concealed cavity leading to a narrow fissure in the canyon wall, an old prospector's crawl space. It was their only way out. "Keep them busy," he said to Miranda, his eyes locking with hers in a moment of absolute trust. He squeezed her shoulder, a gesture that conveyed more than 1,000 words, and then vanished into the waiting darkness of the fireplace. Miranda's world shrank to the view from the window. She fired, reloaded, fired again, the smell of gunpowder thick in the air. Splinters flew as returning shots hammered the cabin. She was alone, the sole defender of a fortress on the brink of collapse. Every second was an eternity as she imagined Zachariah in that tight, dark space, the weight of the mountain above him. The thought of Silas Cain's victory was a spur, and she fired with renewed ferocity, a wordless scream of defiance behind every bullet. Zachariah scrambled through the suffocating tunnel. The gunfire from the cabin was a muffled, distant thunder, a reminder that Miranda's ammunition was finite. He emerged from the fissure behind a cluster of mesquite, his clothes torn. Below him, he had a perfect view of the entire siege. He saw the muzzle flashes from the ridges, and there, near the canyon mouth, protected by a ring of boulders, stood Silas Cain. He was flanked by Pike Cletus and the traitorous Doc Miller, watching the assault like spectators at a cockfight. Zachariah's face hardened. To kill Cain from here would be easy, but it wouldn't be justice. The truth would die with him. This had to end in the open. A ghost in the shadows. He began to circle wide around the battle, his target not the ongoing fight, but its aftermath. Back in the cabin, Miranda fired her last rifle round. The ensuing silence was terrifying. "She's out!" a voice bellowed from the darkness. The assault intensified, the front door groaning under heavy blows. This was the end. Miranda dropped the empty Winchester, her hand going to the single pistol she had left. She would not be taken alive. She would not give Silas the satisfaction. She stood in the center of the room, her back straight, waiting for the door to burst open. But the final rush never came. Instead, a single booming shot from a Sharp's rifle echoed from the direction of the town far behind Cain's men. A bullet screamed over their heads, a clear and undeniable signal. The firing faltered. Another Sharp's shot kicked up dust near the men at the door. It was a warning delivered with contemptuous accuracy. Chaos erupted. The hired guns, realizing they were caught in a crossfire, began to panic. "He's behind us!" "It's a trap!" someone screamed. Silas Cain watched in fury as his perfectly planned assault disintegrated into a rout. "Stand your ground, you cowards!" he roared, but his men were already scrambling down from the ridges, fleeing the unseen sniper who had them boxed in. Then out of the darkness, a figure walked calmly towards them. It was Zachariah Whitman. His Sharps was slung over his back, his hands empty at his sides. Cain Zachariah's voice cut through the night. "Your dogs are running. It's just you and me now." "Kill him!" Silas shrieked at his remaining men. Pike and Cletus raised their pistols, but Zachariah's hands were a blur, his Colts seeming to leap into them. He fired twice, not at the men, but at the ground before them. The bullets kicking up dirt were a final insulting warning. his money or your lives." Zachariah said, his voice deadly calm. Pike and Cletus looked from the cold certainty in Zachariah's eyes to the sputtering rage of their employer. They were killers, but they were also pragmatists. They lowered their guns and melted into the shadows. Loyalty had its price, and Zachariah had just made it too high. Only the trembling Doc Miller remained beside Silas. Zachariah stopped 20 paces away. The routed posse was gone. From the cabin, Miranda watched a silhouette in the doorway. It was never about the marriage. Was it? Silas. Zachariah's voice was a low indictment. It was about the water, the aquifer under her father's land. You'd torture and kill just to be king of a mountain of dust. "This valley is mine," Silas screamed, ripping his pearl-handled revolver from its holster. He fired wildly, the bullet whistling harmlessly into the night. He was a man consumed by his own venom. Zachariah stood his ground, a statue of judgment. As Silas raised his pistol to fire again, Miranda acted. Creeping along the canyon wall, she had gone unnoticed. She hefted a heavy rock and threw it with all her blacksmith-honed strength. The rock flew true, catching Silas squarely on his gun hand. With a sickening crunch of bone, the expensive revolver clattered to the ground. Silas screamed a high, thin sound of pain and utter shock, clutching his shattered hand. He stared at Miranda, his eyes wide with disbelief. The woman he had tried to break had been his undoing. Zachariah walked forward and kicked the fallen gun away. He looked down at the whimpering tyrant. "It's over, Silas." Morning came, painting the sky in soft shades of rose. The battle was done. Zachariah and Miranda marched Silas Cain and Doc Miller back towards Redemption Gulch. The townsfolk, drawn by the wild tales of the routed posse, emerged from their homes. They stared in awe at the procession, Zachariah, tall and grim, Miranda bruised but radiating an unbreakable strength, and Silas Cain, their invincible tyrant, now a shuffling, defeated prisoner. The shamefaced sheriff, seeing the tide, had turned, quickly arrested Silas and the doctor, suddenly eager to be on the right side of justice. In the center of the town square, on the very spot where she had been tortured, Miranda faced the people. Her voice rang out clear and strong. "Silas Cain punished me for saying no. But he didn't want my hand. He wanted my land. He wanted the water that lies beneath it, the water that belongs to this whole valley. He would have kept you all in thirst while he sat on a hidden throne. Today you choose, to live in fear or to build something new, together." A murmur went through the crowd, growing into a roar of liberation. Zachariah stood back, watching her. He had been the catalyst, the bullet that began it all. But Miranda, she was the fire. She had taken her pain and forged it into strength, not just for herself, but for an entire town. His war was over. His ghosts, for the first time in a long time, were quiet. He looked at Miranda, seeing not the victim he had rescued, but the woman who had fought beside him, who had saved him. In the ruins of Cain's petty kingdom, something new and fragile was beginning to grow. And for the first time since losing his Sarah, Zachariah Whitman felt the unfamiliar stirrings of hope. He had found a reason to fight, and perhaps a reason to stay. The story of the rancher's bullet isn't just a tale of rescue. It's the story of how one act of courage can ignite a revolution in the hearts of the fearful. It's about Miranda Lowell, who endured the unimaginable and rose from the dust not as a victim, but as a leader. And it's about Zachariah Whitman, a man haunted by his past, who found his own redemption not just by pulling a trigger, but by standing for someone else when no one else would. Their battle was for more than survival. It was for the very soul of a town, proving that true power isn't owning the land or the water, but possessing a will that cannot be broken. If this story of grit, betrayal, and hard-won justice resonated with you, please give this video a thumbs up to let us know. Share it with someone who loves a true Western tale of courage. And most importantly, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss our next story from the dusty annals of the Wild West. Thank you for listening.